Well, I'm hearing it's 13 years since Apocalypsia was produced. It's 13 years since we went to the Amazon and then eventually to Jerusalem. And it was always intended as something that wasn't just for the millennium. It was intended as something that was setting a pattern that happened in the millennium that would carry on and have a lasting effect over time. And so I'm coming back here to revisit it 13 years later and to try to show you the key of what it's all about and why we did it. There are two streams of dialogue in our description of reality currently. We have the scientific description in which the universe maybe began from a Big Bang 13 billion years ago, and life has existed on Earth for a third of that entire period, and has gradually, from very simple life forms, become, through evolution, much more complicated life forms, leading to conscious life, leading to humanity. And there have been various crises on Earth, major species extinctions, and we finally come to the point that humanity itself discovers culture or invents culture, and we have a population explosion, huge amounts of human impact, and then we have a potential existential crisis on the planet caused by humanity's own impact. Some people are skeptics about climate change and so on, but there's very strong evidence that the sheer effects of humanity, not quite like a cancer growing on the planet, but with some deleterious impacts of laying waste to huge areas of natural diversity, could bring about a planetary crisis, a mass extinction, on a huge time scale, vastly longer than humanity has existed as we know it as a cultural phenomenon on the planet, and on the same sort of scale of millions of years that caused the dinosaurs to be wiped out and previous mass extinctions. So this is a major crisis in the scientific worldview. Complementing the scientific worldview is an older view which is broadly aligned with religion and with shamanism and with a viewpoint of creation myths, and it seeks to describe our situation in very different terms. And the question is, how can these two descriptions come together? And so the journey of Apocalypsia was to try to produce a rite of passage in the same sense that the founding of Christianity was a rite of passage. Even the crucifixion is a negative rite of passage. But Yeshua's mission was, in a sense, a rite of passage that brings about a change of worldview. Now, if we look at the religious tradition, I'm going to particularly look at the biblical tradition, because that's the one that Western culture, it's huge. Judaism, Christianity and Islam all involve this tradition. It goes back to a creation story in Genesis. And there are two creation stories actually. There's Genesis 1, which describes a sabbatical creation, and it's a creation in 7 days. The religious fundamentalists believe that Earth's only 4,000 years old, but evolution can't take place because God ordained that all the creatures would be in a certain kind of pattern, even though they're made in a very strange order where the sun and moon are made after the plants, and it doesn't have any logical sense scientifically, but it has a tremendous poetic appeal, and an appeal as literally God's word in the eyes of fundamentalists. The other story is the story of Eden, and the story of Eden is a falling out between humanity and Yahweh, and a falling out between women and men that culminated in humanity being cast out of the garden. It's alleged that the woman betrayed Adam. Eve listened to the serpent, and instead of discovering wisdom, which she sought, is alleged to have discovered the knowledge of good and evil, from which all of the negative confrontational aspects of reality ensued. So God then casts Adam and Eve out of the garden by the sweat of their brow. Women are supposed to be obedient to men. It's somehow connected with sex because they covered themselves with fig leaves. Woman is cast in the role of the sexual transgressor, to have pain in childbirth and to be ruled over by her husband. And a long period ensues where there's kind of a retreat from God. And in Jewish folklore traditions, the Shekinah retreated. There was a feminine face of God that retreated from the face of the earth when we got out of sync. And a long period of tumult and crisis ensued. And it comes right through to the present day, and we see in the idea of apocalypse that there is some kind of unveiling. Unveiling is normally a word associated with marriage. It's normally the unveiling of the bride. But unveiling is the covers being thrown off reality in discovering that we come face to face with the actual nature of reality in a way that we maybe have originally only seen through a glass darkly. So the millennium was a time when it was perceived to be a date that religious apocalypse might, Jesus might come back to the second coming. The awakening, it's a time of awakening, and it is the chime bell of apocalypse. And Christianity, in a sense, is this description of reality is really a description about consciousness. All religious traditions are about our conscious experience of reality, and not so much about nature. Nature is often secondary. It's cast as evil, the slime, the fallible nature of natural existence. Sexuality is regarded as a dangerous entity. And on the other hand, men particularly seek to look to eternal life in the sky in some relationship with God. And we have this long ongoing sense that we are coming towards an age where everything will be revealed. That's the awakening, the unveiling. Now, there's a way that this could be explained in deeper terms than religious traditions, like even Judaism, which is the ancient mother religion, and that is that human consciousness itself has been in a state of culture shock since we all first emerged from gatherer-hunter society in small bands and in little village cultures, and started to describe our life journey over the epochs. We found we fell out of attunement with gatherer-hunter nature, began to form urban societies. So we developed these creation myths, trying to explain to ourselves the existential condition of future shock, accelerating change. We invest beliefs in God, while at the same time these beliefs are actually driven by heroic people of one kind and another, some of them prophets, some of them even generals or heroes that are the leaders of city-states that then become deified. Some of them are prophets crying in the wilderness that in their generations are cursed and only have an effect later. But this brings us to the idea that the messianic personality is somebody who has a sense of how to bring about a long-term state of future goodness, and acts as a founder for a new paradigm of existential consciousness. Now, I want to emphasize that religions are about consciousness. We can see that because heaven and hell are conscious realms that we don't associate actually with the physical universe in any meaningful way. The idea of heaven up in the clouds is now made meaningless because we know the upper atmosphere is tending towards a vacuum. The stars and planets aren't fixed on some sort of firmament, which is like a big ceiling over a flat earth, like a dome over the flat earth. None of these things are real. You can't expect to find angels up in empty space. Neither do you expect down underground to find realms of... Well, we know that the centre of the earth is hot and consists of molten iron and other heavy elements, but we have no belief that Satan is hiding in the bowels of the earth. So we have this description. It's a description about existential situations. Heaven and hell are our negative and positive ideas of consciousness, about trust and betrayal. taken to extremes, and in some ways Jesus and the whole Christian tradition was apocalyptic in a sense of the people at the time believing there was an incredible state of crisis. Jerusalem was actually sacked shortly after the time of Jesus, and over 1 million, one person, 50 in the entire planet was wiped out. It was a time of political tumult, but that consciousness and that idea of cosmic war between God and the devil is a confrontational idea, and it's maybe not how the full process would legitimately come about in such a way that life and consciousness can go on in a constructive, coherent way. The idea of apocalypse should be a coming together in which the threads that have caused conflict become resolved in effectively a golden age of paradise. And that the challenge in the scientific worldview is to how to avoid a hard landing and how to bring about something that we've lost. Instead of being in a state of crisis where human impact may destroy our heritage for our future generations, we need to know how to preserve the earth over thousands and millions of years while we get a chance to more deeply appreciate the nature of the cosmic condition. So the quest of Apocalypsia, it was called Apocalypsia to add the feminine element, was to make a mythical journey that would, in the millennium, celebrate a healing process which is a kind of antidote to the negative energies of the Christian mission of Yeshua, involving conflict, crucifixion, and bring together the lost elements that are to do with men dominating women and God dominating men, and this imbalance which has marred the integration of reality in a compassionate and healing way. So I managed to secure sabbatical leave, partly to go to do a millennial conference in Jerusalem. But what I did was I combined academic and vision quest type vigil, and it entailed going to the Amazon and traversing the Amazon and looking at human impact, because the Amazon really is our Garden of Eden on planet Earth. It's the largest. There are other ones. There's lots of temperate areas that are very biodiverse and extremely important. There are huge biodiverse areas in Indonesia, in the Congo Basin, but the Amazon is the big daddy Garden of Eden of planet Earth. So one part of this vision quest was to go to the Amazon and film human impact, which we did. We did the burning season in Bolivia, and then did a traverse right across the Andes and down the Amazon, filming as we went, looking at human impact. And this is the scientific question of what are we doing to the Garden of Eden. And complementing that was a quest to say to the world tradition of religion and spirituality and the discovery process of the stream of consciousness of our becoming, to go back to Jerusalem and to relive in the millennium how the healing might actually take place as a rite of passage. So I went with Jane and my son Heath back to Jerusalem to basically celebrate two things. And one is the reunion of the masculine and the feminine, of women and women and men, woman and man, male and female, to correct the patriarchal dominance of the last 4,000 years, which is invested in Christianity and in elements of Judaism and in Islam. All of these religions have fundamental components of control of female reproductive choice in particular, stoning women for adultery, cursing Eve, women to be seen and not heard, In Islam, women only half the value of a man, to correct that, because that has to be corrected for the religious tradition to gain its own integrity, and to pronounce the reflowering. In the Christian tradition, the tree of life grows in the city in Revelation, the 12 gates to the city. The tree of life stands, and the ultimate post-apocalyptic sustainable, spiritual, natural future revolves around the tree of life. And the tree of life is not just a tree of life with 12 monthly fruits in the creationist kind of story. The tree of life is the tree of evolution. It's the tree of, through space-time, how we came about as conscious human beings, as well as all the diversity of life. And we exist, we eat, our atmosphere exists through the diversity of life, and we exist as a component of complementary species interacting and keeping this planet alive. So it's absolutely essential that we learn in the religious paradigm that the culmination of apocalyptic history is the epoch of the Tree of Life. So I went back to Jerusalem to celebrate, expressing the Song of Songs, reinvesting the relationship, the sanctity, the sovereignty of the feminine in relation to the masculine in the sacred marriage, which the apocalypse really is. Apocalypsia is the bridal unveiling of that relationship that was fractured in the Eden story, and to reflower the tree of life as the paradigm of the future. Now, it wasn't intended that this would create some cataclysmic result in the year 2000, because we know merely saying something without striking the thunder from the sky isn't going to change the forces of political history and the expedience of major decision making and business as usual. But by actually doing it, by actually going there, by marching on the gates of compassion, the gates of mercy which were closed by the Muslims for fear that the Messiah might return, going to the Western Wall and pronouncing the reunion of the Song of Songs, and pronouncing the reflowering on the Mount of Olives, is a rite of passage in exactly the same way that Yeshua made a rite of passage that was far more confrontational, involving the palm walking, the summer king of the palm on a colt and an ass, and turning the tables, and going through the crucifixion, Dionysian tragedy of the crucifixion. This is a bad lesson for humanity. It creates paranoia, it creates the delusion that we should martyrdom, we should kill ourselves, which now in Islam, violent martyrdom is really in the shadow of Jesus. The whole thing is a negative, accumulating history that drives us towards conflict. We need to resolve that. And in a basic sense, Christianity is it's like religious history in the sense of mythopoetic awakening. Is like a bow, and one end of the bow is the Garden of Eden and the fall, and the other end of the bow is the apocalypse and the reflowering of the tree of life hidden since the foundation of the world. In the middle is the crucifixion, like the arrow that's being pulled back. Now, we aren't at the arrow point. That is the final confrontation, if you like. It's as if we'd pressed the nuclear button in the year zero. We are now at the end of this epoch, and for our own survival we need to bring together the scientific tradition and understand the religious tradition in terms, the kind of terms Joseph Campbell has done. It's not just Christianity and Judaism that have had these religious experiences. The polytheistic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, also have their ongoing stream of consciousness description of reality, and the Babylonians and all the so-called pagan religions also had fundamental insights into the stream of consciousness. And we need to bring these two streams of dialogue together so that we can invoke or evoke a sustainable, perennial, immortal human cultural tradition which actually protects the planet and protects our future generations. So that is what Apocalypsia was set up to make as a rite of passage, that 13 years later, it's a little like Christianity survives on the remote. Everyone all over the world thinks about Jesus in Jerusalem, but when you go to Jerusalem, it's a Jewish city and a Muslim city with a few antiquated Christian people numbering about 14,000, clinging on to an otherworldly notion which isn't as powerful when you're in Jerusalem as it is when you're somewhere else, and it has mythical meaning. And many aspects of Yeshua's miraculous nature are clearly inherited from the polytheistic pagan. Jesus made the most brilliant, it's like Jesus is the Einstein of the Judeo-Christian tradition. He made a brilliant synthesis of all of the religious currents at the time. At the time of Jesus, the Nabateans over in so-called Edom had a Dionysian type religion where they had fertility festivals. They had Dushara was a god that had the tragic mask of and was reborn, and Jesus turning water into wine is the Dionysian ritual. It was celebrated there when John the Baptist was beheaded. He was beheaded at Machaerus during a conflict with the Nabateans. When John the Baptist cursed Herod and Herodias because Herod had married his brother Philip's wife. His previous wife was the princess of Nabatea, and the Nabateans declared war, and John the Baptist had his head cut on a plate in a descent of Ishtar in Machaerus Castle. Jesus attempted to synthesize all of the currents of religious worship at the time and try to start a new path that integrated those things. So he was supported out of their very substance by the women of Galilee, who all came down to see him off in the crucifixion. There's a tremendous amount of Mary Magdalene anointed him rather than being anointed by a priest. There's a tremendous amount of closet fertility worship in the foundations of Christianity that the religious forefathers are in frank denial of, but it was the ingenuity and creative ingenuity of Yeshua that put those things together. And this is why, essentially, although there are a few Jewish Christians, Christianity took off as a pagan religion. It spread like wildfire across, not through, there were Jewish Christians, there was the Desposignes and James the Just, but that was a small movement, and where it really took off was in the so-called pagan world, because Yeshua had crafted the synthesis to appeal to the pagan religious imagination. So we find at Ephesus in Rome, Christianity becomes eventually the state religion, and we have diabolical behavior from the popes as a state religion, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, the Crusades, all violent, negative, and based on the abuse of Christianity and the excuse of the violence of the crucifixion. So Apocalypsia is to heal all of this stuff. And it doesn't matter if it's 2013, it doesn't matter if this is a small video on YouTube, because it actually took place, it actually happened. Somebody had the insight and the sensibility to make the rite of passage at a critical time and to make the central statements which will heal this planet. And it's up to all of us to do that. And central to this are the psychic power plants, because Christianity is an empty yet sacramental religion, and we need to replace the religions of priesthood with us discovering from the visionary sacraments like sacred mushrooms and ayahuasca, for each of us to discover, to make our own vision quest and discover the nature of reality that we contain within us in our natural abundance during our mortal existence, so that immortal life will flourish.